with a prayer. We're starting on the recording. Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for your blessings. We pray you be with us as we think about the history of your work among Baptists. Help us to learn about your work and about how you've worked in the past and how you're working now, and give us greater understanding of serving you and what it is to be Baptist. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so last week we started at the very beginning of Baptists, and we identified the two strands of being Baptist, generally where you had the General Baptists, which were more Arminian free will, seemed to be the first Baptist group. And then almost at the same time, you had the development of the more Calvinistic strand, the particular Baptist, with, interestingly, two totally separate beginnings. And both brands are in England. Both brands are experiencing persecution. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to go forward and look at how the foreign mission movement among Baptists got started. And then we're also going to look at early American Baptists and the development of religious liberty in America that Baptists were very much involved with. So those are going to be our focal points for this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can do the share screen. And start with the presentation. So again, we're going to talk about early American Baptists and the foreign mission movement. So feel free to jump in with a question or a comment as we go along. So when it comes to early American Baptists, we have to start in New England because that's where they got started. And the first, interestingly, Williams was only a Baptist for a few months, but he is an important early Baptist because he set the stage for a lot that took place. And so he was not only an important early Baptist, he was an important early American. And you probably, even in school, studied some about Roger Williams. You may not have been aware that he was a Baptist, but for a few months, but he was an important figure, and we'll talk about why in a few moments. And his life went through several stages. First, he started off as an Anglican member of the Church of England. Then he became a separatist. Remember, we talked about those who felt that the Church of England was not reformable, that you had to pull out of it. Then he was a Baptist for a minute, and then he was a seeker. So those are the phases that Williams went through. The Anglican phase, he was born in England and began his life in the Anglican church, as so many would have during that time. He graduated from Cambridge University, was ordained into the Church of England to be a minister, but he didn't accept pastorate. He was a private chaplain to a manor for some time. That was not unusual during that time where you took on that kind of job. And so that was his Anglican phase, starting off as an Anglican minister, a chaplain at a manor. Then we go to the Separatist phase. By 1629, he became a rigid separatist regarding the Church of England as a false church from which Christians must withdraw. And that was the separatist view. You just got to get out of it. It's so broken, and actually a false church. So he was facing persecution in England. Obviously, that was not a popular view because the Church of England was the official state church, and people who didn't support the Church of England got persecuted. So he accepted a call to a church in Salem, Massachusetts. So Williams comes across the pond to work at a church in Salem. But he gets into trouble there as he's there in Salem, but then the bosses in Boston get concerned about his views. So he becomes an assistant minister in Plymouth, Massachusetts. So Williams returned to Salem in 1633, and despite pressure from Boston, he was installed as a minister there in Salem in 1633, again, still kind of separatist Anglican. But then officials pressed charges against him because of his rigid separatism. Now remember, though we're in America, many of the colonies had official churches, official state churches that were supported by the state and defended by the state. So this was the same in Massachusetts and again in many other colonies. So officials start pressing charges against him because of his criticisms and his separatism from the Church of England. In January 1636, officials were ordered to arrest Williams and send him back to England. And so he's going to be arrested, sent back to England for trial, and I guess probably prison and all those bad things. But Governor Winthrop of Massachusetts warns Williams, and Williams fled to the wilderness. So he just runs off, gets away, and goes there. So this then is fleeing into the wilderness, which ended up being Rhode Island. Eventually, Williams goes into his Baptist phase. So he moved to Providence Plantations, which was in the wilderness. And remember, this is very early, so there's not much settled in America. Went in the wilderness just outside the Massachusetts Bay jurisdiction. So he goes just a little bit outside Massachusetts jurisdiction, so he can't be arrested and shipped back over to England. Sometime before March 16, 1639, Williams and several others formed the First Baptist Church in the New World. So it wasn't like a church in England said, hey, let's start a church in America and send people over. There were just others who had knowledge of Baptists, and there may have been some Baptists among them, who came together and let's start a church. So this becomes, in Rhode Island, the first Baptist church in America, in the New World. So how did
Robert, I'm just curious, the question, you say before March 16, 639, that's a pretty definite date for something, to date something we don't know. So what happened on that day, or how to relate it that it was already in place at that day?
Well, we know that the church was up and functioning at that point. So we know that at some point, let me go back.
I just curious what establishes it was up and functioning on that day.
That's a date that they know that the church was functioning by that time. They have documents that show that the church was meeting and functioning. So, but they know that it started sometime before those documents that they have. So that's a good question. That's why that definite date, because again, they have old documents showing that.
I mean, like I say, a definite date for an ambiguous beginning.
For an ambiguous thing, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I get that.
Okay.
So how did Williams become a Baptist? Well, he was familiar with Baptists from England. Baptists were around, and so he was aware of them. He studied Dutch, a language that the Anabaptists spoke. We talked about the Anabaptists last week, and so many of the Anabaptists spoke Dutch. Plus, when he went to Providence, he encountered Baptists who were there. So these were, again, Baptists who just happened to be in that area, and so he encountered them there in the Providence area. So those are some of the factors that led to Williams becoming a Baptist. He remained a Baptist for only about 4 months, so I said like a minute. And like others, he left the church because he had doubts about the authority of his baptism. And that was something that I think legitimately people worried about. You want to be, if possible, in the line of succession from Christ and be able to show that. And a lot of people were worried about that. So Williams stopped being a Baptist because he wasn't sure about the authority of his baptism. But the Baptist church he started remained and remains to this day in Providence. So, so he found a church, left it, but the church kept on going. Kind of like Smith back in Holland, John Smith, who left the church, but Helwys and others carried the Baptists forward. So, and Williams was not just important for being a part of founding this First Baptist Church in the New World. He made many contributions, important contributions to American history in general, and they include missions to Native Americans. He began to share the gospel with natives. Also, he had the weird idea that maybe we should pay them for the land we took. That obviously was not popular view, but that was his view, that yeah, we should actually pay these people for taking their land. Religious liberty. In fact, Rhode Island would go on to be the first colony in America to have religious liberty and separation of church and state. So he's probably most known for that, for being an outstanding proponent of church-state separation. And again, for Baptists and others, you cannot have religious liberty without separation of church and state. As long as there is a state church, it will always lead to persecution of somebody. So that's very important. Democracy. Also, the colony that he helped found was really emphasized democracy at a time when, again, we're still got English colonies who are under the monarchy. They're still under the King of England and still subject to him. So they are not democracies. So so that was important to Williams as well. So he contributes, again, missions to the natives, religious liberty, separation of church and state, and democracy. So I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions about Roger Williams. Again, a few sketchy details. Again, we don't know precisely when he became Baptist or precisely when the church was formed, but again, we know documentation by that March 16th date, it was still there. And I believe that church is still functioning. It's not a Southern Baptist church. I think it's probably an American Baptist church, or as well. We won't explore it all, but there are many brands of Baptists. So Southern Baptist is the largest, probably American Baptist is the second largest, but there are others. For some reason, I was just thinking today when we served in San Antonio, Texas, we had a lot of military people come through, and I discovered more brands of Baptists than I knew existed. There were Conference Baptists from the Midwest that I never heard of, and of course, lots of Independent Baptists. So there are many different little subsets of the Baptist brand. So anybody have any questions about Roger Williams or the starting of this First Baptist Church in Rhode Island?
Well, he was an American Puritan minister.
Actually, he was Anglican.
Pardon me?
Williams was Anglican. He was from the Church of England and a separatist. So Puritans were a bit different group, but the Puritans were in Massachusetts, but they were a bit different group. But they kind of all, you may remember last week we said that Brewster and that whole group and the Baptists were kind of all sort of in this boiling soup of stuff in England, and there was a lot of cross-pollination of that. But Williams was actually a separatist, not a Puritan. Puritans want to purify the church. Separatists said, forget it. Good question. Any others? Well, if not, we'll continue forward to the, hold on. Oops, go back.
Did you lose it?
Go back to the share screen. the foreign missions movement, which is really, really important. In fact, the whole modern foreign mission movement was birthed out of English Baptists.
Oh,
And the great foreign mission work we see today came from this work that we're going to talk about in this next section. In the early 18th century, remember, the particular Baptists are the more Calvinistic tulip group who are very into predestination and all that. In the early 18th century, particular Baptists began to decline because of the growing strength of hyper-Calvinism. In other words, leaders began to feel that it was an affront to God to be involved in evangelism and missions. They sincerely thought that God would save those people when he willed to do it. And they also taught, you might say, well, what about the Great Commission, in Acts 1:8 and Matthew 28:18-20? What about those passages? Well, they said that was just for the early church, that those commands were no longer valid for the church. So that was their feeling. And again, it was all developed from this hyper-Calvinism, although strange though, a lot of strange stuff happens with Baptists. Strangely, the foreign mission movement would come out of particular Baptists, and that would be where it would form from. So one of the leaders of this movement of hyper-Calvinism was a man by the name, again, of John Gill. John Gill was a British Baptist who was very influential. And again, he felt that it was an offense to God's sovereignty to offer the gospel to unregenerate sinners, that was wrong. And here's a picture of John Gill. He looks a little bit severe when you look at him, but he was the one of these hyper-Calvinists who said, again, it's against God's will to engage in missions or to offer the gospel to sinners. But in Kettering, this is England, not Maine, in Kettering, a young pastor named Andrew Fuller began to question these views and advocated preaching the gospel to the unregenerate, an actual innovative thing. So, hey, we should preach the gospel to those who don't know Christ, who've never experienced him. So he wrote an important book called The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation, which was published in 1785, which urged, again, the preaching of the gospel to the lost. And here's a picture of Andrew Fuller, again, a very important figure in what people call the modern missions movement. In 1761, William Carey was born in the Northampton village of Paulusbury. I guess that's how you pronounced it. And he was, like everybody else, pretty much reared in the Church of England. So Carey starts off in this Church of England environment. But as a boy, he was fascinated by stories of travel. He was especially fascinated by the voyages of Captain Cook, and that became an important thing for him, traveling, what was going on in the world. So he developed this global vision and curiosity about what was going on in other places in the world. He became an apprentice shoemaker, and in 1783 he became a Baptist. He was basically a self-taught, self-educated guy who read a lot, learned languages himself, studied himself, and did all these things to learn about the world, about the Bible, about theology. So again, in 1783, we know he becomes a Baptist. And here's a picture of Carey, who lived until 1834. Carey began to speak at Baptist meetings. One of the primary meetings they had at the time were Baptist associations. Associations were the earliest form of Baptist cooperation or fellowship. And associations were usually kind of local. But Carey begins to speak of these things, and he began to feel called to preach. So he was called to be pastor in Moulton and continued to cobble shoes, yet at the same time, again, self-taught, learned Hebrew, Greek, Latin, Dutch, French, and several other languages. So he's studying all the time, learning all these different languages.
And he was bivocational.
And bivocational to boot. So literally to boot.
Literally to boot.
So, anyway, he's working very hard, learning, gaining knowledge. In 1787, while attending the Ministers Fraternal of the Northampton Association, that would be like the ministers group of an association, he proposed the following topic: whether the command given to the apostles to teach all nations was not binding on all succeeding ministers to the end of the world. In other words, again, we come back to that question: was the Great Commission valid for today? That's what it comes down to. Again, many of his peers, the educated ministers, were saying, no, that's an affront to God's sovereignty. That is getting in God's way, and we shouldn't do that. And
That
so,
was their argument is that was a first generation command only. Then I guess. Really,
yes, yeah, and I've seen that used with other things. Like I've heard people say, speaking in tongues or heal, all that was just for the gospel era. But I'd never heard of the Great Commission being in that collection of things. But in the late 1700s, it was that, again, there were just certain things that were just for the early church, and the Great Commission was one of them. To me, but it would raise the question: if it's always been a matter of God's sovereignty, why would it have been okay then and not? Why would it have been okay then? So
why did they? Yeah. What? Yes, exactly. What was the?
I'm sure they have an answer for that, but that does raise that question.
Well, because he said it had to be authority. It had to be a command for some period of time, I guess.
Right. So anyway, in May 1792, Carey preached from Isaiah 54:2, and after that he made an emotional plea, and he made an emotional plea after that. And after he made that emotional plea, the association adopted the following motion: resolve that a plan be prepared against the next, that means, before the next ministers' meeting at Kettering, for forming a Baptist society for propagating the gospel among the heathen. So the heathen was just a word, they used at the time. But this is the start. It comes from Carey's preaching and his advocacy of engaging in what we would call today international missions. And the mechanism for doing that was a society. As we go along, we'll see that Baptist societies were the first ways that Baptists came together to support missions. And a society, you could join this society as an individual or as a church. So societies were formed in that way. So this is the first mission society, and it's aimed at what they would call at the time propagating the gospel among the heathen. So from this came what came to be known as the Baptist Missionary Society. So it was birthed out of this, and would become a mission promotion sending group. Carey accepted an appointment as a missionary of the society to India, and he moved to Serampore in 1800. And it was a rough go. Carey is pioneering here. He's doing something that hasn't been done for a really long time.
Help me with my history, because was India an English colony, a British colony at that time?
I think so.
I don't know the early date for establishing the
Yeah, it
colonial
was.
presence.
It was a British colony at that point in 1800. I feel pretty sure.
I feel like it was too, but I didn't know. I was curious.
But that's a good question. But it is a really rough go, and you know, again, he doesn't know a lot about the culture or the people, or anything like that. And one of the big struggles there that they immediately ran into was this custom, and it's still a pressure today in India. When a man died, his wife was supposed to throw herself on the funeral pyre and die with him. And did y'all encounter some of that, Toby, or some of that?
Yes, we have. We have a good friend who is a widow, a believing widow, who is ostracized by much of her community because she did not do that when her husband was killed in a bus accident.
So I assume I guess that's a Hindu thing. I'm not really sure.
I believe it. Yes, it is a Hindu thing. Basically it's an economic thing. She should do that so as to not burden the community and her children with her upkeep when her husband dies.
So it was a rough go. They ran into stuff like that, and sadly, Carey's wife just did not. In fact, Carey's wife went insane from her time there in India. It was that difficult and such a high cost. But again, this is the start of Baptist, and really nobody else was doing this either. This sort of going out and doing foreign missions in this way. Of course, there had been a history of missions from Catholicism. We know of early Catholic efforts in America, particularly out in Texas and San Antonio, back again where we lived. There was the Alamo was a part of a chains of Catholic missions on the San Antonio River that were started there, and they would form whole communities and seek to reach the natives. But and that many times didn't go well either. So, but again, a lot of this was the birth of the foreign mission movement, and the big mission movements that we see today come.
I guess I must have heard some of this story, because when you mentioned William Carey, the name was ringing a bell for me. I don't know. Maybe it goes back to I'm looking at Judy and thinking about, I know all the years of mission education that she did in the church, and I'm betting it goes back to me as a Sunbeam or an RA. Well,
if you spend time as a Sunbeam or an RA, you learned about William Carey at some point.
I bet that's what it's ringing. It's for certain. It's from some familiar from somewhere.
And it seems like this is always this is a constantly evolving sort of thing. And Southern Baptists would go on to build a really great foreign international mission board. But so much is changing right now. Where used to, one thing we prided ourselves on as in the Southern Baptist family is that missionaries didn't have to raise their own support. Well, now that's changing as the financial base of support is eroding in Baptist life, and for various other reasons, that whole thing is shifting. And also another interesting thing generationally is a fascinating thing is more young people than ever are interested in being international missionaries, but a low percentage of that group wants to do it for their whole lives. They want to do it for a period of time. I was fascinated. I was able to I had some talks with Jay Brantley. I was doing some minister training with them Toby may remember us doing that, but
Yes.
Jay had said initially they thought they would just do this for a few years over there. But now that they're building a house, getting the community, and now they're seeing it as more of a lifetime work. So even Jay and Sumter, I think, went over there thinking of maybe a 5 to 10 year commitment, but now are looking at a much longer time. Any other question or comments about
Yeah.
Carrie?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Judy.
You know, when we were growing up and studying missions, we learned a lot about what was happening with missionaries that were called to serve in the area of medicine, doctors, nurses.
right.
We built, the Southern Baptists built a lot of hospitals in India.
Right.
That is no more. We do not do medical missions. And I was really, really surprised. And that, I think, was that about 15, 20 years ago that all that stopped. And so that was a major calling on people's lives in the field of medicine. And I remember Isla Evans, Dot Evans' daughter, went to work with Rebecca Naylor in Bangalore. And she served there. Also, Sue and Allison Banks were there as associate missionaries, not, for a short period of time while they were building the hospital. And Sue set up the pharmacy, and Allison was helping with, the engineering part of building the hospital. So, I mean, that's a huge change to me when I realized, that's all. Also, agricultural missions is not a phase. It is not a responsibility of our mission team anymore. So those two areas, there's been a huge, that's a huge change.
As the SBC made a more rightward shift in the 90s and leadership changed in IMB, they shifted from medical missions and stuff like that into emphasizing church planting. Trish and I met Lee Baggett, who back in Vernon, Texas. Lee was a career medical missionary in Guadalajara, Mexico, and there was a Mexican American Baptist hospital there in Guadalajara that did a great ministry. And the head of that hospital was doubled as a pastor whose church had missions all across that area. But they didn't dismiss Lee, but they made him, he had no training as a church planner, but they made him go out and work in churches. But his argument was, I reach a lot more people through medicine than a lot of these other other missionaries doing stuff. In other words, he was able to share Christ with more people through that than through being forced into church planting. So that's a real shift. So like you said, Rebecca Naylor, who's the daughter of Robert Naylor, who was president of Southwestern Seminary, they shut that down, that big hospital there in India, and that really caused some hard feelings among the people there that this was an important service. So the issue now is again, as Southern Baptists, and really all denominations American denominations are declining, as Southern Baptists decline, their funding declines, and also they have tremendous turnover in their mission force. Again, with young people only wanting to do it for a few years, but actually they have at the same time really cut down the training required for missionaries. For example, in my younger days, even if you're going to be a medical missionary, you had to go to seminary before you went over and serve. Well, now they've cut out seminary, so you don't have to do seminary anymore to do certain kinds of missions over there. So again, it has changed, and it is regrettable that medical missions, because I've known some young doctors who would love to go and do that, but there's certainly there's nothing really right now within the Baptist family for people to be able to do that. But again, it's kind of part of this constantly changing, where now it's interesting. You can do international missions here in the United States. You can find a people group, as you've heard me share in Vernon, Texas. We had a group of Chinese right there in the backwaters of Texas. So you never know where you're going to find pockets of people who can be reached. So all of that, and then also you've got I can't remember the technical terms, but tent makers, people who can go into the country, say as an engineer or something, but not be able to go in as a Christian missionary, yet also are able to share Christ through their work context. So a lot of creative things are happening. It's just like everything else changing. Well, let's go on and get into the struggle for religious liberty in America. So now we got Baptists in America. Baptists are growing. As I said last week, Baptists never started a revival, but they always benefited from revivals. So Baptists are growing and becoming increasingly strong and influential. So one of the first things that happened, well, again, in England, early Baptists faced persecution. In England, they met in back streets, alleys, attics, and cellars because of the persecution they felt. Pastors were jailed, like Thomas Helwys, and we think Helwys may have died in prison. We know other Baptist pastors did die in prison. So it was a very difficult situation for them. And so we mentioned that early Baptists, last week we mentioned that early Baptists had a great passion for religious liberty. And we said that came from their experience, yes, but also from their theology, that salvation comes about because of the work of the Holy Spirit with an individual and not by an action of the state or anybody like that. So Baptists have this passion. John Smith, we talked about him last week. John Smith said this: the magistrate is not by virtue of his office to meddle with religion or matters of conscience or force or compel men to this or that form of religion or doctrine, but to leave Christian religion free to every man's conscience and to handle civil transgression, and to handle only, it should be only, civil transgressions. For Christ only is the king and lawgiver of church and conscience. So Smith is one who's saying that the king, magistrate, has no right to interfere in religion or conscience, but everybody should be free in that area because Christ and God are the only lawgivers and the only ones who can make that judgment of conscience. Thomas Helwys wrote, "Let them be heretics, Turks, Jews, or whatever, it appertains not the earthly power to punish them in the least measure." So Helwys was even radical enough to include non-believers, Muslims, that's what they called Muslims Turks in those days, even Jews, because all these groups were persecuted. And it would have been easy for Baptists to say, well, give us toleration, but persecute these other people. They came to the position that everybody should be free. And everybody should have their, again, freedom of conscience to believe or not believe as they are led in their own hearts and souls. Now, remember that, again, we're going to 1776, right about the time of the American Revolution. At that time, all the colonies still or just about all of them had state churches. In the North, the Congregational Church in places like Massachusetts was the state church. In the South, like in Virginia and Georgia, the Church of England was the official state church. So you still had, even though you're in America, you still had blending of church and state where they were together, and most people believe that was the right thing. That's how it should be. That's how you honor Christ. So in 1776, Jeremiah Moore, and again, Baptists had been imprisoned in Virginia. Moore and other preachers preached from their jail cell windows to people outside. And so Baptists gained a lot of popularity because they were sincere, they were willing to suffer for their faith, and they were kind of rebels. So that gave them a lot of credibility. So in October 1776, remember, same year's Declaration of Independence, a Baptist pastor by the name of Jeremiah Moore petitioned the Virginia Assembly for religious liberty. And they were seeking a champion, someone who would take up their cause within the assembly. And then, amazingly, Thomas Jefferson, who definitely was not a Baptist, was not even what we would consider an Orthodox Christian, took up the cause. Because what he and Baptists had in common was that there should be freedom of conscience and there should not be a state church. So that started, and so Jefferson drafted a bill and presented it to the Virginia Assembly. Now, immediately controversy got raised, and many assembly members opposed it fiercely, saying, we should not do this. Church and state should be together. One of the fiercest critics was Patrick Henry. You know, Patrick Henry was also an early patriot, an early revolutionary. So Patrick Henry argued against it, and one of his main arguments was that if the state, and that should be, didn't fund the church would die. So the idea was that, look, churches cannot make it on their own, that if we take away government funding, then churches will collapse and we'll lose this important moral force in our state, in our culture. So, and it's interesting. There are many books and articles and sermons and seminars saying that the founders never intended there to be separation of church and state. The founders intended America to be established as a Christian nation, and they'll quote people like Patrick Henry. And again, Patrick Henry wanted that, but he ended up being a minority person. So you have to go by what the majority wanted, and also what Baptists wanted, and it was not with Patrick Henry. So you have to be careful. People will distort that view. So others propose a compromise that the state create a list of favored churches. In other words, saying, okay, Baptists, we'll include you in this list of favored churches, but we won't fund or help other churches. So that was also a compromise, but Baptists were not in favor of that either, because you still have a state regulation of churches, and who is, do you really want government deciding what are bad churches and what are good churches? So that was going on as well. So it took 10 years. The bill finally passed in January of 1786. And so Virginia becomes, other than Rhode Island, the first colony and the first, state within the forming United States to have religious liberty. And it begins there in Virginia. So that's an important instance. So any questions or comments about what went on in Virginia? Another important person in Virginia was a man by the name of John Leland. And this is a picture of Leland, who was a Baptist pastor. Again, he was a popular Baptist preacher and outspoken advocate of religious liberty. When the Constitution appeared in 1787, reaction to it was mixed. And one of the big problems was Baptists like Leland were concerned that it contained no real guarantee of religious liberty. That the first, offering the first Constitution passed had no guarantee of religious liberty. And the reason why was that those who wrote it, the founders, felt it was too controversial. They were looking to get as many people on board with that as possible. But it was, sometimes we think of the founders as these gods with halos and got along great. Well, that, they were politicians, horse traders, all of that. So all these things they were great people, but it was very much a political process of doing these things, a lot of swapping back and forth. And so again, they didn't include religious liberty, a real guarantee of that in the original Constitution. So that really stirred up people like John Leland. So James Madison, what you've heard of, was a candidate to be Virginia's representative to Congress, and he supported the Constitution. Leland entered the race against him because he believed the Constitution should have in it a specific guarantee of religious liberty, that was important. So Leland was willing to run against Madison and campaign against him because of that issue. But it appears that Madison met Leland in Leland's home, and the two reached an agreement. The agreement was that Leland would withdraw from the case, withdraw from the race, and that Madison would make sure right off the bat that there would be religious liberty in the Constitution. And also, Jefferson proposed the idea of a Bill of Rights, that what should come out next would be a general Bill of Rights that would guarantee a collection of liberties. And so that will become the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, again, what we call the Bill of Rights. So the very first phrase of the First Amendment to the Constitution says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the very first phrase of the Constitution. So there are two parts, you see there are two parts of that. The first part is what legal people call the Establishment Clause, that there'll be no official religion, no establishment of religion in the United States. The other part of that, the second phrase, is called the Free Exercise Clause, that individuals will have the right to exercise their faith. So no established faith or church, and then free exercise. And that order is important because, again, Baptists and others argued you have to have disestablishment in order to guarantee religious liberty. So you disestablish the church, because whenever you have an established church, there's going to be persecution. And then you guarantee religious liberty. And so we'll come back to this in a moment. There's the kind of ongoing argument we've had ever since that was written is the balance between those two clauses. And at times, the court has leaned one way or the other. For decades, the court has leaned toward the no establishment clause. And that goes back, say, to the O'Hare decision that outlawed state-sponsored, state-written prayers in school, to other decisions like that. Now, it seems to be leaning more in the other direction, sort of more in the free exercise clause. In other words, elevating the free exercise clause a bit above the no establishment clause. And that is shown more in the recent decisions about the funding of religious schools and the case of the coach and the prayer in Texas. So in those cases, the court seems to be going more in the direction of putting free exercise above disestablishment. And so that there's this ongoing argument there. Oh, I went the wrong direction, sorry. Sadly, and I mentioned this in sermons a couple of times lately, there's a growing Christian nationalism in our country that presents the false narrative that the founders intended to establish Christianity as our official religion. And therefore, the government, the state should support that and be formed by that. But we see from history that it was not the intention of most of the, again, with any group of people, you're going to have different opinions. And there certainly were founders who were indeed, well, let me just get back. Founders who were indeed in favor of the blending of church and state, but the majority didn't. In fact, the writers of the Bill of Rights could have, in fact, they talked about making Christianity the official religion, but they rejected that. So the reason why that's, I think it's dangerous for both church and state, Christian nationalism, is that it becomes an idolatry on one end, that you idolize, let's say, America, or again, Christian nationalism is not unique to America. The Germans in World War II, they had a form of Christian nationalism that got blended with Nazism. So it's not just an American thing; it's international thing. And in India right now, I was reading this morning, they're talking about resurgent Hindu nationalism in India, where again, you have a blending of Hinduism in India and what it causes there. So you've got Christian nationalism in different countries, you've got Hindu nationalism, you've got Islamic states in other places. So there is this, again, this tendency to want to blend religion and state. And it's a real concern. I mean, it's a growing thing, especially among evangelicals today, that I'm really concerned about. And I think it's something that we need to be aware of. So any questions or comments about any of that? I got to get a cough drop, sorry. Any questions on that? Mike?
Through this study last week in this, from the formation of the First Baptist Church, or when Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic faith and created the Church of England, it seemed like that was the beginning of a lot of different movements. We talked about all these different individuals from 1400 on up to the, not too distant past. How do they come about doing this? I mean, did they just say, well, hey, I think I don't agree with this. I think I'm going to try to start something else. All right, that's fine and well, but how did they get sponsored to do this? Even if they went from one country to the next, somebody or some agency or some group had to sponsor them.
They did get support. Yeah, like, okay, going to, well, actually, it really goes back to Luther and his beginning of the Reformation in Germany. And then it spreads across Europe and to England. And so it gets to England, and at first Henry VIII is pro-Catholic, but then because of his own personal agenda, he breaks off from the Catholic Church. But you're right, he needed the support, and even Luther needed the support and protection of German royalty in order to be safe. So there were nobles people like that who supported. Now, if we're talking about Luther, of course, Henry VIII needed support of nobles. So all that was there. As for Baptists, they really didn't have much of that. They were kind of the back, the backwater people, the non-desirables. And so they didn't have any of that. However, in America, as America was forming up, Baptists did gain popularity. They gained popularity because of their courage, their willingness to face persecution. And also Baptists supported and participated in the Revolutionary War. Obviously, if you're tied to the Church of England pretty strongly, then you're not going to be so strong a revolutionary. But Baptists, of course, were rebelling against all of that. So that gave them impetus. So to answer your question, in Germany and England, Henry VIII and others did have support of nobles and people like that. But Baptists did not have that kind of support, and they had to work more through popular appeal than through, particular nobles or people in government, people like that. So that's.
I have another question.
Sure.
Or an observation that throughout the centuries, all these different movements, that tells me that the people were not satisfied with their religious life.
That's
and
true.
They more or less were looking for something that they can identify with. And an individual would pop up, say, okay, here, this is the way that we think we should do it now. And next thing you know, they had followers. But there is something there in the past that would influence the individuals, the people, to not accept what was being given to them.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And particularly in America, I talked about Baptists benefiting from revivals and not starting them. When the great revivals in America came about because of George Whitefield, who came more from the Anglican thing. But what Whitefield, again, what obviously was going on in England too, but even more in America, Whitefield and others brought about the idea that one, you had a choice about your faith, that you had a choice to follow Christ. You had a choice about which church to go to. And in many ways, this laid the foundation for democracy in America. Because if I can choose my own church, I can choose my own government. I can choose my own leader. So this early sort of revivalism contributes to democracy in America because of the matter of choice. But as you're saying, Mike, people began to hear this different kind of preaching, and you have to remember, what else did people have to do in those days? So you would go and hear preachers, and preachers would preach hours sometimes, and so you would hear these new teachings that the state can't produce a believer, that it has to come from your own decision. And so there was that. Again, Whitefield, the Wesleys were part of that too, where they were proclaiming this individual experience. Wesley talks about this heartwarming experience he had, this and this personal relationship with Christ, which from the state churches, it was say, well, this is the state church, you were born in this, you were baptized as a baby, you're part of it, and that's how it is, and you don't need to be listening to these other guys, that they're off, they're leading you astray. So there was a big struggle between the established like Anglican Church and others, and these newer groups like Baptists coming up. So really, but that raises an interesting question.
When we were over in England, we made a point to go to some of the local churches, and it seemed like every single one we went to, they had the same opening statements or prayers, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Or mission statement. And in that mission statement, it said, we believe in and support in the Church of England. That statement's in every single one of them, which I thought was rather interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. But interestingly, you know, there's again, Church of England is still state church there. If you watch the funeral of Elizabeth, you see that connection still between the monarchy and the Church of England. But it's basically, you know, very few in England go to church at all. And of course, concern here in America, the same sorts of things are happening. Church attendance is going down across the boards. The percentage of people who go to church becomes lower each year in America. And so now that doesn't necessarily mean that people have no spirituality. Many of them do. But it is a concerning thing that's happening even in our own country for different reasons. Any other thoughts or questions? Well, appreciate all of you being here. Next week, we'll continue forward. We'll talk more about the development of churches in America, about how various mission societies get formed, how you have the beginning formation of denominational, you know, structured as Baptists get, structured Baptist work in America and across the world. So be looking forward to that conversation as well. So any other questions or anything before we go? Well, if not, y'all have a great evening and thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.